Welcome to SORAPod. It's Maureen and Sahil here. Today, as our guest, we have Leyla Jagiella. Leyla is a cultural anthropologist and a scholar of religion who has worked on orthodoxy and heterodoxy in Islam and gender and sexuality in Muslim societies. As a Muslim trans woman, she's been a community activist for more than 2 decades and has held workshops on trans Muslim intersectionality and empowerment in Germany, the UK, Pakistan, Malaysia, and South Africa. She has worked with LGBTQI plus refugees in Germany and is currently project coordinator of the Jüdisch-Muslim Cultural Festival at the Muslimische Akademie in Heidelberg, Germany. Her book, Among the Eunuchs, A Muslim Transgender Journey, was published by Hurst in 2021.
So, welcome, Leyla.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very excited.
As are we. So, as some of the listeners know, and Leyla, you also probably know, we ask all of our guests to choose a color for the podcast, and we wear it in solidarity with them. So, Leyla, I'll let you do the big reveal and explain which color we're wearing and what significance this has for you.
We were wearing black today, which allegedly is not a color, actually. Some people keep reminding us of that. I'm wearing black because it's in the Muslim calendar, it's the month of Muharram. And it's traditionally the month in which we, that is in particular Shia Muslims, but also a lot of Sunni Muslims of a more Sufi background, especially in South Asia, commemorate the martyrdom of the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, Imam Hussein, in this month. He and his companions were massacred in Karbala, which is in Iraq today. And so this month is in particular taken as a month of mourning and remembrance of this struggle of this Imam and his companions.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Leyla. And I think, in some ways, this is, thinking about the events of Karbala and Muharram. This is sort of a great topic also for our podcast, which is also about community and also thinking about solidarity, thinking about justice even. So thank you for selecting this color and also highlighting the fact that we're starting this podcast in Muharram. And I think, of course, there's no way our listeners would know, but I have to admit, Leyla and I have been friends for quite some time. In fact, our paths crossed several decades before we actually got to know one another virtually and then finally meet each other. But yeah, that was back in the early days.
Wait, you can't just say that. Your paths crossed before you knew each other. Please explain.
Exactly. No, I was gonna say it was back in the early days of the World Wide Web. When Leyla used to write on a, well, sadly now retired blog. I don't know if Leyla would want to elaborate a little bit more on that, but I actually had no idea that this blog that I would read on occasion was hosted by the very Leyla Jagiella, who several years later we connected on Facebook. But Leyla, maybe you could start by talking about that blog. And what that was for you.
We didn't even call it a blog back then, did we? Right? I mean, it was just it was a web page. It was one of these GeoCities pages, and it had the very, very cheesy name Leyla's Chayhane, which Chayhane is like it's a tea house basically. And I was publishing little you could call them blog entries on Muslim trans issues, because that was what concerned me personally at that time, more than 20 years ago. And what else to say about that? I don't know. It was pretty much my my first step into publishing something of writing. Funnily enough, when we discussed, when we were talking about this podcast and what we're going to talk about, and you sent me this list that said, okay, we're going to talk about writing. I didn't even think of that. In hindsight, yeah, well, I guess a lot of us have this experience that, when you're very, very young, you start with writing and you publish some things, but then when you look back to them, it's all a little bit embarrassing, and you yourself, you don't really actually want to look at it and the stuff that you wrote back then. But it was very important for me at that time that I could do some research and do some thinking and make that public. And I do know that it was very important to other people as well, because at that time there was not much available about Muslim trans issues or Muslim queer issues or in general Muslim diversity. So I guess it was important to me and to others, even though it was a bit cringe.
No, I mean, I think you're already touching on several of the things we wanted to discuss today. But, clearly writing has been a big part of your life. I'm sure there were many things you're writing even before Leila's Chaikhana. Maybe we could come back to that a little bit and then consider your relationship to writing. How would you describe that? And, you said you initially didn't even think about Leila's Chaikhana as part of your writing. So if you think about your relationship with writing, say, over time, how do you say it's developed or changed throughout your life, and how do you understand it now as opposed to earlier?
Oh my. I think writing was always very important to me, and it had been from, very, very, even before I could read and write, I always wanted to, and I was bugging my parents or others. Why can't I start learning how to read and write already, even though I'm not going to school yet? But somehow at that time, I think nowadays parents would probably do that and just teach you a little bit. But at that time, somehow it was supposed to be not, it wasn't supposed to be a good thing to prematurely teach children or something like that. I don't know. So, but I couldn't, I was very impatient about finally going to school and learning to read and write. And then later, as I grew up, I always wanted to be an author. That was, if you would have asked me, especially during my teenager times, what do you want to be when you're an adult, I would have said an author. That is something that
You didn't want to be a cultural anthropologist?
Whoever wants to be a cultural anthropologist.
I didn't quite know what that was, and I wrote about it in my book. Actually, the first time I heard about cultural anthropology, and which was actually through a Satyajit Roy movie, as a teenager at some point. No, but I did also want to be an archaeologist. In my primary school days, I always wanted to be an archaeologist, actually, which is, it's a little bit related, right? It's close.
In America, archaeology comes under anthropology, so
Yeah. So, but then somebody told me that you need a lot of maths for archaeology, and so I said, okay, I can't be an archaeologist. Yeah, but anyways, I always wanted to write. I started writing as a child, my little stories, my little imaginations, also thoughts on life. And well, later, as I said, when it was around that time that I created that web page, it was a lot about, finding myself, understanding myself as a Muslim and a trans person, doing my research on that, and writing it down and publishing it, and that somehow just it was very easy for me to do that. And when you ask me how has your relationship to writing changed over the years, I have to say I don't find it that easy anymore to write, you know. I say that in particular after having published a book, and writing that book was torture. Um, Trying to write a PhD thesis, which I tried before publishing that book, was even more torture. Um, each time I agree to write and publish an article for some outlet, and first it always feels great. Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I'm going to write this article about this. But then when it comes to actually sitting down and writing that article, it's going to turn into an act of torture and procrastination. So the ease that writing seems to have embodied at some time in my life, it's not there anymore. But I think it also has to do with the fact that life has become so much more complicated for me. I mean, no, I can't say that life was always a bit complicated for me, as a trans woman and in other capacities, but just the world that we live in with so many distractions, trying to make a living, trying to survive, all of that going on. I think that just makes it much more difficult to write. And so I still, whenever I actually manage to finish some writing, to complete something and then publish it, I'm so happy. And I love rereading my own writing, not if it's 20 years old, but apart from that, I do. But yeah, the process itself is very painful.
I wonder if maybe it's the genre that you're writing in, that's making it so torturous. Like, because you said, you used to write your little stories and your imaginations, and I wonder if you still do any of that, or if that's just fallen away to this more maybe analytical, critical type writing, and maybe that has something to do with it.
It has something to do with it. Sometimes I do, this, I don't know, I think it's some kind of self-help advice or something, that you're supposed to write 1 or 2 pages each morning or something. It's called morning pages. I don't know who invented this concept, but I do that sometimes. I just sit down in the morning and just randomly write something down, and that still gives me a lot of joy, and it's not as torturous. And also something else, I'm quite I think you can call it active on Facebook. Um, I'm of that generation. I'm otherwise completely, I don't use any other social media, but on Facebook, I'm very present. And I have this habit of, every few weeks, I write these long Facebook posts on, just something that I'm thinking about, and that just comes out of my heart, out of my mind, and it just happens, and I enjoy it, and the people who read it enjoy it. And then every now and then it happens that somebody contacts me and says, "Oh, this Facebook post of yours was so great. How about turning it into an article for us?" And then the torture starts again, which is very, very strange.
So, I mean, that's really interesting, because I was, before Maureen asked the question, I was actually going to say, neither of you know each other on Facebook, and I have to admit, I don't.
You're never on Facebook.
You
don't even know your password. Remember, you lost it.
I did. I do, however, sometimes go online to check if I have messages. But you are perhaps 2 of the 3 or 4 people that come up on my feed, and you both have this in common. I've read both of your academic writing, but I've also read both of you putting these little stories up that are beautiful, that are ethnographic and historical. And it's interesting to me, Leyla, that you mentioned, how writing the PhD was so torturous and writing the book was torturous, right? Yet these little, I don't know what you want to call them, snippets, or in a way, they're almost like blog posts, are in themselves, in my opinion, immensely ethnographic and, if not metaphysical, and so forth. So maybe could we pick apart a little bit, when you say, writing the PhD was torturous, writing the book was torturous, what is it? Aside, of course, there are the structural things, but maybe can you describe what is that physical, perhaps an emotional experience that you have that makes it torturous in writing?
I think it has to do with the fact that I've always had issues with authority and issues with structure. And when I write these little Facebook articles, it's just, as I said, just I have a thought and I think, I'm going to write it down, and it just comes out of me. But as soon as it's supposed to be an article or a book or something like that, I become very conscious of the structure that this is supposed to be embedded in. And yeah, and in the end, I mean, it's interesting. In the end, that's probably also why at some point, or it's part of why at some point I decided to leave academia and not be at the university anymore, because I realized that I could develop my thoughts and publish my thoughts um, in a much better way when I'm not so worn down by all that structure. I think, yeah, I think it has a lot to do with that.
Leyla, everything you're saying is just really resonating with me. So I love writing little Facebook posts too, and they get longer. But I play this game with myself. It really is a game. I try to take events that are unrelated and stick them together in a way that will be interesting to the reader. And I mean, I'm not intentionally trying to be funny, but people find it hilarious. So I've realized this is a kind of humor that I'm creating. And then when I go and I try to write beautifully too, but then when I go into academic writing, I hold myself to the standard I must write beautifully academically, but I also realize I can write humorously academically. But
Mm-hmm.
it's not appreciated except by the reader. It's not appreciated by the editor or the publisher or the reviewers. They don't care. They're just going to pick at every detail. But like when I go to a conference and I'm presenting, you know how your conference audience is completely dead most of the time. But if
Mm,
you make them laugh, you're like, oh my gosh, they're listening to me. They're alive. They're here. They're
mm,
paying attention. And I feel like when we're using Facebook, we kind of get that audience response in a way
true.
don't get in the academic publishing process. And it feeds our creativity and our desire to keep pushing forward with our work.
True, true. It's a lot of that, the direct interaction there, which can also be negative. We all know the negative
True.
aspects of
Are
of
there
social
some
media,
examples of that, Leyla, that you could give?
of negative
Hmm.
reactions. Well, it's just, I mean, we all know that on social media, people can get very, very negative, and that's in particular, it's very, um, let's put it this way. I value my own vulnerability a lot. I think vulnerability is something that makes us human, and that's very central and important. And showing vulnerability is very important because um, well, it is very important, period. But in particular, I again and again I make this. I have this experience that I show myself vulnerable with a specific struggle, and then suddenly other people start talking about that as well. And and vice versa, we often have that kind of experience that we think we are alone with a certain thought or a certain issue. Um, and then somebody else starts talking about it and becoming vulnerable about it, showing themselves vulnerable, and it's very healing and helpful. However, it does happen, of course, that I share something quite intimate or something where I show myself as very vulnerable. And then you have these people online who are just going to use that or they think they can use that to hurt you even more, or give you negative reactions, insult you. Um, that does happen, and it's not a pleasant experience at all. However, I do have to say that I guess for somebody like me who values her vulnerability and showing herself as vulnerable so much, these people who try to do that, they probably don't understand that I'm already prepared for that to some extent. It's not, you know, when you're already showing yourself in that way, then you know what can possibly happen, and it's not going to affect you in ways that these people think that it affects you. But still, objectively, it's very negative behavior. It's not. It's very much exposing of the negative traits of human beings.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No, that's sorry, go ahead, Maureen.
How do you prepare yourself to remain vulnerable or to deflect that, or however you think about doing it?
I don't know whether I have a method. I think it's more it's an agreement that I've had with myself at some point, that I say, okay, I told myself, okay, Leyla, you will have haters, you will have people who will react negatively. So if you want to walk that path, then you have to accept that. It's part of the deal.
That also sounds very appropriate for Muharrem.
Oh, it is. Yes, definitely. Definitely. I have had this. I had a conversation recently because we have, well, as all over the world, the anti-trans discourse is becoming very violent now, and I had an event together with another trans person recently, somewhere here in Germany, where the flames of that kind of hate are particularly high at the moment, and and we had discussions on whether we're still going to do that event or not, whether we're going to have more safety or not, more, people, more bodyguards or not, and to all the safety conditions, I said, yes, please, let's have more safety. That's a good idea. That's great. But I also said that, no, I still want to have that event. I still want to do it because I'm not a community activist. If I'm, if I allow these people to scare me that much. And then I said, it just came out of me. I said, well, and if I die a martyr, then I die a martyr. And I was like, oh gosh, what did I say? It's like, oh, it was very Muslim of me to say something like that. But there is a part of me that thinks that way, indeed. Yeah, it's not that I want to provoke it or anything, but I think you either live for your purpose in life or you don't.
Do you mind? It might seem like a weird question, but since I'm in the United States, and I'm seeing these things happen in the community here, like safety issues here are weird because there are many of us who do not trust the police because some of the police work with the people who we feel afraid of. And I'm wondering, what does safety mean where you are? When you're saying...
We had exactly that conversation because it's the same thing here. We don't necessarily trust the police very much. I mean, whoever is, marked by racism or queerphobia, transphobia, we've all had our very negative experiences with the police. And there have been, we've had a lot of cases in Germany recently where it has become public that there is a very strong entanglement between the right-wing scene and the police. And still, on a local level, as far as the initiatives and projects that I'm working with are concerned, we have to, well, we can't quite give the local police up, let's put it this way. So we try to, we're working with them. We're trying to talk to them. And there are people, of course, in the police who also want that, who don't want the institution to be the way it is and to have these kind of entanglements. Of course, there's a general structural problem there. I think, whenever people have a lot of power and they have fire weapons, then there is a very structural problem there. But there are people within those structures who do want to do better, and we try to engage with that as well. And in each case, when a conversation like that comes up, it's a very local decision and a very local debate of, how much you want to involve the police, or do you want to create other forms of safety. Of course, in some institutions we have our trusted bodyguards and people like that. Yeah. But it's complicated, for sure. It's a complicated subject.
Yeah.
Maybe, Leyla, could I, we're moving a little bit from, what we were discussing before, but actually I think, could you talk a little bit about, these sort of the very localized kind of communities of safety, maybe that you've seen or you've helped create, or maybe give our listeners some examples of what that looks like in practice.
Oh, I can't claim that I created them or anything like that.
Of course, I mean that you participated, perhaps.
But for example, you mentioned that currently I'm project coordinator of these Jewish Muslim culture days here, and that our events are of course, in the eyes of the right-wing people here, they are an abomination, bringing Jews and Muslims together and presenting Jewish Muslim culture. And so there is a safety concern there.
Maybe can you talk a little bit about that? Because I don't think everyone might be aware of the context of Germany and why that is important or viewed negatively by some.
If you could give us your eyes for a second, help us see, so to speak, or sense.
Well, first of all, Jews and Muslims are both minorities here, and they are both to a large extent affected by racism. Jews in particular, of course, by anti-Semitism. And I guess I don't have to explain to most of our listeners that Germany also has a very particular history of anti-Semitism. This country is responsible for the Holocaust, and so the subject of anti-Semitism is particularly sensitive over here, in good ways, sometimes also in bad ways, I have to say, because there's there are discourses around Jewishness and anti-Semitism here in this country that, well, by which the German mainstream society basically wants to clean itself of its responsibilities in the past and present itself as, we've learned our lessons and now we are this wonderful, accepting, democratic country, and we support the Jews, and there's no anti-Semitism in this country, but the immigrants bring in anti-Semitism to this country again, especially the Muslim immigrants. So there is in particular a certain discourse in mainstream society that tries to it tries to use some kind of divide and conquer agenda, trying to basically telling the Jews the Muslims hate you and telling the Muslims the Jews hate you, and somehow using that as a mechanism for mainstream society to feel better. But the reality is that Jews and Muslims in this country are in many ways affected by the same kinds of racism, same kinds of prejudices, a lot of the same kind of negative social discourses affect both communities the same way. And a lot of people, not all, because there is definitely anti-Semitism in the Muslim community here, and there is anti-Muslim racism in the Jewish community here. It does exist. But a lot of people in both communities actually see far more commonalities than things that separate them. And in particular among the younger generations. And also something, well, the thing also is that the vast majority of Muslims here in this country have an immigrant background, as we call it in Germany. I mean, we're speaking about
history,
people.
I believe.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, but it's even. I mean, we call people. I mean, people whose families have been in this country for 3 and sometimes 4 generations, and then you're still, you still have that label of having an immigrant background. It's very particular here. So that is the situation of Muslims in Germany, but it's also the situation of most Jews here in Germany. There are very, very few Jews. Of course, after the Holocaust, only very few Jews were left in this country. And the vast majority of Jewish people in Germany come from Eastern Europe, or their parents came from Eastern Europe. So they have that commonality as well. And we try to, with our concept of the festival, we try to bring together producers of art from both communities, and thereby empower a discourse where both Jews and Muslims can actively create their own discourse instead of constantly being the subject of the discourses of mainstream society.
And how do they do
that? That is
that?
the concept of that festival. How did they do that?
In practice, what does it look like in practice, maybe?
Just one example.
Well, I'm a little bit. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I mean, maybe we should also just mention that Leyla, literally, I think today has finished putting on an entire 1-month festival.
Yeah.
Very kindly agreed.
Let me ask the question.
The last event was yesterday, precisely. Yeah.
Let me ask the question differently. What's a highlight from your festival? Tell us something about it. A highlight, something really cool or interesting that you noticed.
Well, I think almost everything that we did was a highlight. It started with the opening in late June, where we had there is a writer here in Germany with a Jewish background, Max Czolek. I think there has been a New York Times article on him as well, so you can find a little bit in English about him. And he's very interesting. He wrote a number of books that are very, very critical of the mainstream German discourse about Jews and Jewishness and their relationship to other immigrant background communities. And we had invited him. He talked about his book. He read a little bit from that book, and we had a nice discussion with him. And then after that, we had it was a music. Not a band. What you call it when it's techno, kind of Oriental techno music, Turkish, Iraqi techno music, something like that, an ensemble or something. I don't know. And they played music and everybody danced. Okay, this is a little bit. It's a very, basic. It sounds very basic, but the important thing is that you have 2 different kinds of inputs. One that is more related to the Jewish community, one that is more related to the Muslim community. Of course, these religious labels are also, that's part of the complicated racist German discourse that everybody who's Turkish Arab is a Muslim. Anyways, but you bring these two different inputs of two different kinds. One is a writer, the others are musicians. You bring them together, and you have an audience of all kinds of people coming there, and they interact with both, and then afterwards they have discussions with both. Neither the writer nor the musicians just disappear, but they are still there, and people can meet them, have a discussion. The artists themselves can talk to each other, network. Maybe that is also a very important aspect of our work for us, that the artists can get to know to each other and then maybe develop other ideas, do something else in the future, so these kind of things.
I mean, it's really interesting to me how, we started talking sort of about, the painfulness of writing under structural duress, right? And you've kind of described something where, this moment where really what you're describing is allowing for space for community and knowledge to emerge, for new knowledge to emerge without placing a pressure on it necessarily. And that is something very hard to describe. I think you've actually described it really well. Both Maureen and I, full disclosure, talk about this, are interested in this.
No, thank you. I mean, yeah, precisely that is it. I mean, I think I got a little bit nervous because I thought, oh, now they're asking me for what kind of method are you using to bring these communities? No, it's not that, we just invite these people and they have a space to do something together, to interact with each other. And the larger community here in Heidelberg, including the Jewish community, the Muslim community, but also everybody else in this city, can take part in it and interact with people and network. And sometimes more emerges out of that, sometimes it doesn't. We cannot control that, but we just want to create these spaces where artists of these different backgrounds can interact with each other, and people from the communities can interact with each other.
So I have a little bit of... Sorry, go ahead, Maureen.
I just wanted to fill in the visual for the listener because they didn't get to see how you and I leaned closer and closer and closer to the screen while Leyla leaned back and forth. I think you were a little intimidated.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I really think at some point we need to have an audio-visual podcast, because I think we talked about this in the other episode, how, so much of what we're communicating, even, I know I use my hands a lot, but all
Yeah.
three of us are
Also,
like...
I do these quotation marks with my fingers, when I said, please, dear listeners, when I said immigration background, that was in quotation marks.
Yes,
You couldn't see that.
Yeah.
But since Sahil and I both study music, we couldn't help ourselves. We just got very excited. So no need to be intimidated. We're just getting excited.
But I have a little bit of a cheeky question, Leyla, because again, I think we're sort of, this discussion keeps skirting around issues of, knowledge that can be expressed and not expressed, right? Knowledge that can be captured and cannot be captured. And, I have these sort of two questions in my mind, but very specifically with regard to, what you just described. You've put on this amazing, from what it sounds like, festival, where it sounds like there's been a lot of these emergent, eruptive exchanges and flourishing, mushrooming of ideas and expression. I'm sure you also have to report on this.
Yeah.
Not to get you thinking about it, but what is that like? And what, I mean, of course, I'm sure it's challenging to describe these things, but how does one report on this?
That's a very good question. I just, while you were asking that question, I realized how, well, that's something that actually gets on my nerves a lot, and that I hate it to my guts. But in reality, it's actually very helpful. The fact that whenever you're working in a field like that, it's a project-based field, so you you have to apply for money from some kind of funding, and you get that money for, let's say, a year, and then you do something with that money, and after that you have to write a report or something like that. But that whole field of work is a very specific field of work, and it's very oh my God, I think it's, in particular here in Germany, it's extremely widespread. Like our whole civil society functions on that kind of project basis, basically. A large and such a widespread and very present field of work. It also has its own discourse and has its buzzwords. So in the end, what you do when you write a report, you just, you look at the buzzwords and you look at the cliches that you have to use, and you look at the, and you just string it all together, and it's a report. And I hate it, as I said. I hate this kind of alienated language, but this is how you do it. This is how you apply for the money. When you write your application, you use that kind of language. And then when you have to report on it, you also use that kind of language, which in the end is a very shallow and very hollow language. It doesn't really convey what is actually happening and what was really going on. Yeah, it's not, it's not something that I like to engage with, but it's a kind of engagement that is necessary in the work, in the world that I live in and exist in and try to survive in. Again, not so different from academia, right? Because in academia as well, you do a lot of, you produce a lot of hot air, you do a lot of bullshitting, you use certain buzzwords, you use a specific language that is expected from you that you would use it. But what is hiding behind that is something else sometimes, and something you would never, you can maybe tell somebody else in private, but you could never tell people actually at an academic conference, unless you're very established and daring. Because sometimes people do that then.
Do they?
Sorry, go ahead, Maureen.
Well, this is kind of leading back to Sahil's questions, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that slippage between kind of saying what we know we're supposed to say, or presenting in the way that we are supposed to be presenting, which I'm going to admit that I'm really bad at. So maybe why I don't have an academic career. And then talking about the things that we really care about and want to know about and are passionate about. Like, can we just talk a little bit about that slippage in any context, academia or out?
Oh, sure. I mean, I wrote about it in the introduction of my book, actually, and I use very strong language there. I think I say that it's a kind of rape. I always felt that in particular what we anthropologists do is a kind of cultural rape. You take something which is actually a very intimate experience. I think every anthropologist encounter is very intimate. And then you just ignore the actual intimacy of the encounter and put it into some structure, some kind of language, just because you have to be liked by other people, basically. It's a betrayal of love, and it's a betrayal. It's a kind of rape. And fortunately, I think I don't want to talk too negatively about anthropology, because I still love anthropology. It's great, and I love the work of a lot of anthropologists, and I think anthropology has done more reflection on these kind of processes than any other academic field. I think it's important to admit that. I don't think that, for example, in history or in other social sciences, people have done as much reflection on this problem. But even more so, it does astonish me that we have turned this reflection into some kind of, it's something ritualized. It's something, okay, every anthropology student has to read about it. Everybody has to talk about it. Everybody has to mention it at once. We all, in our PhD theses, we have to write that one little segment where you reflect on your own positioning, blah, blah, blah. But then again, you still do it. You still do this nonsense. It's horrible. It's really horrible.
Is there a way to honor the intimacy of the encounter? Like, can you envision it?
Well, I think it again boils down to showing yourself as vulnerable, being vulnerable. But when you do that, you're very quickly, I mean, there's a peer pressure there. There's a culture in the departments, you know, it's everywhere. And not everybody can really, and especially when you are already in some kind of marginalized position, because you're a woman, or you're a trans woman, or you're a person of color, or you're a Muslim, or anything, that then you already, you know, you're constantly struggling with that, you're constantly fighting with that. And then when you show yourself vulnerable and you get these kind of reactions from your peers, not everybody can go on that easily.
I mean, for those of us, or listeners, maybe Maureen, who aren't familiar with Layla's book, I really recommend reading it. I'm not saying this just because you're my friend, Layla, but there's several reasons. But primarily, it is for this very sensibility and accountability with which you write about the various communities that you find yourself within, that you're placed within. And I think that, you know, that first chapter of Layla's book is, if I were still teaching classes, I would assign it as an example of how to think about and write about one's place and vis-a-vis others, community, and so on. And I think, Layla, you described it really well. I think a lot of us feel this, and I know it's a lot of anthropologists also talk about this. Um, I think maybe it would be nice, perhaps, if you could talk a little bit about, you know, this, because on the one hand, maybe there's a pleasure, but also there are very real conundrums about writing about community. And I'm thinking specifically about this first chapter of your book. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about how you have navigated this process about writing about community. What are some of the pleasures you found, and what are some of the challenges that you faced in writing about that?
How did I do that? How? I have no idea.
Well,
really,
I think that
I did it. I tried to.
I mean, on the one hand, you've said that, yeah, you know, it's about
Yeah,
showing yourself as vulnerable. But
yeah.
maybe, you know, really what I was asking is that when you say, because we can say that, we can say, let me be vulnerable. But what does that actually mean? I have an idea of what that means for you as a reader. But for you, what does that mean to say, I am showing my vulnerability?
You know, I think it's difficult to convey that to other people because it has a lot to do with my own very personal, let's say, hauntings. And maybe other people are not haunted the same way by these kind of issues. And so this is something that's not going to help them if I say that. Yeah, that's just how it is. You know, people are what they are to some extent. I have always been very much haunted by the idea of dishonesty, quite frankly, and not presenting something that I am not. And obviously that's very much something related to being trans as well, you know. It's something that I had to think about from a very early age of my life, that okay, what kind of persona do I present to the world, and how authentic and how real is that persona or not. I see a lot of people in our world who don't have any issues with that, and maybe I don't know, maybe not everybody has to be authentic. That's also possible. Not everybody has to be honest. Maybe, and to some extent, I mean, no human being is 100% authentic. No human being is 100% honest. We wouldn't be able to have a social life if that was the case. We have a mask. We all hide some parts of ourselves. Okay, but I always wanted to be able to show as much as possible of myself. But that also means realizing that other human beings are the same as you are, and they also may have a need to show themselves the way they are, and they do not want to be misrepresented, and they do not want to be just used as a prop in your academic work or something like that. You know, it has to do with realizing that the authenticity that you want to present, that your own authenticity, that when you want to present that, then the other people that you're engaging with should also be represented in as much authentic ways as possible. And if you cannot do that, then at least make that visible, you know, because sometimes you can't. There are certain constraints. Sometimes that's precisely, I mean, I say that as well in my book, that I cannot speak actually for other communities. I can only speak about my own experience with that community. So it's a book about me, myself, and my experiences. And some people might find that maybe a little bit narcissistic also. But in the end, it's the only honest way that I can write about these things.
Right.
One of my research participants, so to speak, was a composer who, like, his hobby was opening geodes. And he said that both people and musical works are like geodes. You have to work on them very carefully and open them very slowly so you don't break what's inside, but also so you can reveal the actual beauty that is to be seen.
Mm.
And it seems a bit like what you're describing.
True. Yeah. Yeah. I like that metaphor.
Yeah. No, it's wonderful.
His name was Alexei Agabalov. We'll give him credit here. He's deceased.
No, and you know, something you'd mentioned early on in our discussion, Leyla, was how I think you were talking about you know, this process of writing, and sort of how, you know, sort of like the craft of writing was painful in academia, and you sort of left partially because you felt you could write and express yourself uh, more effectively in the ways that you wanted. Yet, of course, you said that even writing the book was also painful in its own way. And here, you know, you've described really nicely for us this honesty and truthfulness about oneself and one's limitations in writing and expressing and describing. Um, is it possible for you to maybe think about that? What was it that was different between, you know, your experience within an academic institution and your experience with a publisher? What was that difference that, you know, and I think you can take your time, but maybe because both of those things were painful in their own ways, right? But what
They are.
were,
They are.
you
I have to say, though, that I mean, of course, when we're talking about a publisher, there are all kinds of interests there within the publishing house, and not everybody there is running after the same interests, of course, but the people that I've been in contact most were my editors. And I have to say my editors were very kind. They were really, really nice. I've had mostly, I can say that, really positive experiences with them. And they do stuff for you that in academia nobody would do for you. For example, there are only very, very few footnotes in my book. Actually, really very few ones where I refer to some piece of literature somewhere or some source, academic source. Yeah, I do. Right, I mentioned your PhD thesis, Sahil, and I didn't have to do the footnotes myself. The editors did that for me. And when that happened, I was like, oh my God, this is heaven. This is paradise. Because footnotes is my personal hell, basically.
But I think this
Having
is a
to,
good thing to highlight just because what you're saying, in case somebody listening isn't an academic, is that academic labor is this very solo, grueling labor in which you are
yes,
your own first editor. And then when you send something off, it's peer reviewed, which is
oh
different than being
yes,
edited. You get criticized and questioned, and why didn't you read this, or why aren't you talking about this? And you have to kind of fight to maintain your own thought instead of letting your thought be
yes,
swayed, pulled into someone else's. And if you can
yes,
do that, then your work can be published, which I is not what the editors in this publishing company do. They do a different type of labor, which is
yes.
more,
You
it sounds more supportive.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, as I said, I had very kind editors. I think the experience could have been quite different with other editors. And also, sometimes you do have to argue with your editors as well, because sometimes the editors don't understand you, or they don't actually understand what you're trying to say. And there are some passages. As I said, writing this book was torture. And when I finally got around to having written the bulk of the chapters and having sent them in, I mean, to be honest, I didn't want to deal with that text ever again at that point. I was just done with it. And then still your editors come back with it, and they have their questions and their remarks, and sometimes they want to change something. And there are some passages in my book where I was just too tired of um, of arguing with the editor, and where I thought, yeah, let them. It's fine. I'm done with this text. If they want to change the paragraph a bit and want to add something or remove something, let them do that. So there is that. It's not, it's
I've
it's
been there.
yeah,
I get it.
yeah. But I mean, it still in general the I'm so, because now I'm also in a position that I'm publishing articles, and I'm paid for it. And sometimes not that much, but still you are paid for it. And then I'm thinking back to my academic times, and I think, oh, this is the way academia is structured is so insane. The work that you have to do for which you are not paid, and you're just doing that work because you're promised that it's somehow going to contribute to your academic success. Um, but there's no guarantee for that, because positions in academia are so limited, and it's really insane. And just this experience, and I'm not saying that in the free publishing world, I mean, there's rampant capitalism. There are all kinds of other issues there that I have problems with. I'm not saying, yay, please all leave academia and write book. And I don't want to say that, but what I'm saying is it's just it astonishes me. um this experience astonishes me that suddenly it's acknowledged that writing an article is actual work, it's effort, it's time, and you should be paid for that. And the same with footnotes. I mean, my God.
You had this question, which we kind of touched upon, but let's ask it directly and then maybe wrap it up.
Sure. Do you want to ask it?
You said your question is what has influenced you about how you think about knowledge and how it's valued? And we've kind of skirted around it and walked through it. We just haven't addressed it directly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if we, there was a point at which I actually wanted to ask it when, Leyla, you talked about, when you said, well, if I die a martyr, I die a martyr. And there was this issue of like, can this be said? Can this not be said? But I think it also indicates to me how you value knowledge production, as some people might call it, or knowledge creation. So yeah, so connected to that, I think, that's maybe a starting point to think about what has influenced how you value knowledge, how you think about it, or think.
Yeah. A lot of things. I think, of course, to some extent, upbringing. I think I've been in I've been in a situation as a child that not too many people are in, that my paternal family and my maternal family are very different, and they come from quite different backgrounds. And when I'm thinking of, my first lessons on knowledge, I'm thinking of my grandparents, both sets of grandparents, but they were from quite different worlds. My paternal grandfather was a Polish coal miner, and my maternal grandfather was a learned theologian. And my paternal grandfather had he loved gardening, and he had a lot of knowledge about gardening, about animals. He was a great storyteller. He was just making up stories for us as children and telling these kind of stories. And my maternal grandfather was more he was an academic. He was interested in academic subjects. He was also interested in stories. He loved Greek mythology, but you see this classic Greek mythology. And I think that gave me a very good insight as a child already, that there can be very different kinds of knowledges. We love that plural in academia. Do people still do that? I don't know. At my time, when I was still at university, it was a big thing to use this plural of knowledge. No, but I learned that as a kid there are different kinds of knowledges, and I think that is a lesson that I've carried with myself ever since, and it's of course a very important lesson for an anthropologist as well. Then my faith, certainly. Islam is a religion of knowledge. It's like people love quoting this saying of the Prophet that we are supposed to seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. And in particular in Shia Islam, this is it's a huge thing. You can, if you compare a typical Sunni hadith collection and a typical Shia hadith collection, the first thing that you will see immediately is this big deal that is made about knowledge in the Shia hadith collection, with which I don't want to say that Sunni Muslims have no interest in knowledge. That's not my point. I'm sorry, no offense to anybody, but we just, there is a very, very strong discourse around knowledge in Shia Islam in particular, and I do think that does influence me a lot as well. In general, the wisdom traditions of Islam, which we also have in Sufism, for example. And what is very important, I think, in these Muslim traditions of knowledge and wisdom is that knowledge is not only about your rational knowledge, but it's also about the knowledge of your heart. And actually, your heart is the seat of your knowledge. It's not so much your head, your brain that is traditionally considered the seat of knowledge, but it's the heart that is considered the seat of knowledge. And this is how I see knowledge as well. And the third aspect is, I think, just a certain experience in life and keeping an openness to it, not thinking that you have figured it out. I always think of knowledge as an ongoing process. I think it gets problematic when you think you know it, you got it now, you understood it, finally, you have the truth. Then if you think that, then you're stuck, then you have an issue. But knowledge is always something dynamic. It's always that always continues, and the search for it always continues. And I think this last aspect is probably the most important one to me, that you have to keep it. You have to keep that aspect alive, and only then knowledge is actual knowledge. Only when you allow it to flourish that way.
So you're not going to give us a grand theory of everything, Leyla?
Well,
Not yeah.
I'm very, at this point in my life, I'm so close to it, but not yet.
Well, thank you, Leyla, for sharing all of this with us today. And you've spoken so beautifully and eloquently about your experiences, not just with writing, but with community, with feeling and solidarity and emerging community even. So before we leave, I think I was, we did ask this question, but maybe could you perhaps leave us with what are your hopes for the future, and maybe what hope might you share with our listeners, some of whom are in academia, some of whom are not, some of whom are writers, and some of whom are not?
She would prefer we asked her for the grand theory of everything.
I think that's easier than hope at the moment. We live in a very well, no, I do have hope. I just find it difficult to put that hope into into simple sentence or something like that. I do very much believe that not only knowledge is dynamic, but also human history is dynamic. I think we can say that for sure, that everything that's happening is dynamic. And that as long as that is the case, we can always hope for something better. And of course, we are experiencing a time now where a lot of things seem a bit hopeless, the still ongoing conflicts in the world, the struggles, the problems of climate change that I am very worried about, and I don't really see politics addressing that, but also the structure of society is very stuck, and with it the structure of academia and of academic work and anthropological work is all very, very stuck. But in human history, nothing has ever been stuck forever, and so I don't think it will be stuck forever now. Things will move on, something will change, and maybe some things will change for the worse, but some things will definitely also change for the better, and we just have to hope for that. Yeah.
And I think I can't think of a more appropriate message to give during Muharram. So
Indeed.
Thank you, Leyla, again for speaking with us today and giving us your time. And of course, we have to ask, and I think I can assume the answer, but can we welcome you into the Society of Reluctant Anthropologists?
Yes, definitely.
Welcome then.
I am the incarnate reluctant anthropologist.
Well, thank you very much, and we'll look forward to hopefully our next discussion sometime.
Thank you very
It
much.
was so nice to meet you, Leyla. Sahil's talking about you all the time, and as we were talking, I began to realize, oh, he's been sending me posts. Oh, I know Leyla, I just don't know Leyla. So I'm so glad to actually meet you.
Lovely.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to SORAPod. We're always glad to have more people joining the Society of Reluctant Anthropologists. You can find us online at sorapod.com. That's SORAPOD.com. If you have questions, comments, or a great idea for a future podcast, get in touch with us at hello, HELLO, at sorapod.com.